What are we waiting for? Let's talk about Batman. Batman: The Long Halloween Part 1. Now, The Long Halloween Part 1 is the latest DC animated movie, and it's a pretty good one. I have not been the biggest fan of these DC animated films. I've enjoyed several of them, but the quality tends to shift drastically depending on what story they're adapting. But if I had to pick, my top three favorites is probably Justice League Doom, Batman Under the Red Hood, and The Dark Knight Returns Parts 1 and 2. Those are what I would consider top quality DC animated movies, and The Long Halloween Part 1 feels right at home along with those movies. It's surprisingly good. I wasn't sure how good it was going to be, because when they do some of these literal adaptations, it doesn't always go as well as we hope. But you could tell that the animation team behind this movie really put their best foot forward in trying to adapt this story faithfully, but also changing a few things here and there to just make it a bit more cinematic. And going into this movie, my biggest concern was the animation. Reading The Long Halloween, the artwork in this, it's very exaggerated, almost abstract, where you're not always sure exactly what you're looking at. But it does help to convey the madness that is brewing within Gotham City. And that is a really hard thing to adapt in animation, especially with DC's usual animation style where it's very solid. You know, they have very specific character models that always stay on model. They don't usually go too far into the kind of Ren and Stimpy style that I think would have worked for a Long Halloween adaptation. But for this movie, while they didn't try to match the art style exactly, they also didn't fall back on their usual style that we see in a lot of these DC animated movies. And they actually came up with something pretty unique. And it's a style that I can only describe as a grittier version of Batman Brave and the Bold, where it has these thick lines and very angular features that do almost feel reminiscent of that Silver Age style and almost kind of Hanna-Barbera-esque. But where Hanna-Barbera and Batman Brave and the Bold were very bright and colorful and vibrant, here the colors are more muted and grungy with some harsh shadows that does match the film noir tone that the graphic novel definitely had, and this movie matches perfectly. And another thing that they changed from the graphic novel visually is a lot of the character designs. Like I said, the graphic novel, a lot of the character designs, like the Joker for instance, are very exaggerated. He almost looks more like a demon more than a human being in most panels. But here, because the animation style is different, they went with something a bit more familiar, and I think they pulled a lot of influence from Batman the Animated Series. Not just with the Joker and the Penguin, but especially with Catwoman. Now, Catwoman in The Long Halloween has a pretty iconic costume. It's that purple with the big ears and the tail. And I was never the biggest fan of that costume. I always thought she looked more like a mouse than a cat. Maybe that's just me. But here they definitely pulled a lot of inspiration from her costume from the first few seasons of Batman the Animated Series. You know, back when she had the gray costume with the black around the face. Here they do something very similar, and while I do love that look of Catwoman from the animated series, I think I like this one a little bit better. The general look is the same, and it still has the black around the eyes, but it's a darker gray that feels a bit less conspicuous, that it would blend in with the shadows more, and I just think it's a better design. And while I'm talking about Catwoman, she was voiced very well by Naya Rivera, who tragically died last year, and they did have a nice memorial credit at the end, because I'm pretty sure that this movie and Part 2 is the last movie she ever worked on before she died. So it was nice that they had a little something extra for her, and I thought it was tasteful. And the voice cast across the board is amazing. You got Jensen Ackles as Batman, and I think it's kind of funny that Jensen Ackles actually played the Red Hood, Jason Todd, in Batman Under the Red Hood, another one of my favorites. And now he's kind of been promoted into the Batman role, so that's kind of cool. And as much as I love Kevin Conroy, I think Jensen Ackles does a great job at bringing a younger Batman voice. He's just a bit more optimistic. He's not as hardened as Conroy's was. And it is cool seeing him be this younger, year 2 Batman. I was actually kind of surprised at who they got to be the Joker in this movie. They got Troy Baker to do the voice. And Troy Baker did an amazing job as the Joker in Batman Arkham Origins. His Joker voice is almost exactly the same as Mark Hamill's Joker voice. Although, again, he has a bit more youth and vibrance to him. And if you listen closely, there are some inflections that do differentiate them, but they are very close, almost indistinguishable. And if you love Mark Hamill's voice, you're going to love Troy Baker here. Because he's the guy that you get when you can't get Mark Hamill, but you still want that classic Joker sound. and he does an amazing job. He actually had me cracking up a few times. I actually forgot how many good lines the Joker had in the Long Halloween book, and seeing them on screen, it just had me laughing. What can I say? And even though this is only part one of a greater narrative that we will see very soon, I had a great time with the story of this first half. I think in part because the Long Halloween is so broken up into these separate holidays, and each holiday is its own little adventure with a Batman villain, you don't feel cheated when you don't get the epic conclusion until the second movie. You can still watch part one and enjoy these little adventures, seeing Batman solve crimes and actually be a detective for the first time. I thought that was really cool. And this movie really leans into the fact that this is a Batman year 2 story. It's still very early in Batman's career. It's not year 1. I mean, we already had that animated movie. But here Batman's already been introduced to a lot of his rogues gallery, except for, Two-Face. Two-Face isn't a thing yet, but I bet he will be soon. But I just love stories that focus on this time period in Batman's career because it's the first time he really has to be a detective and think beyond just street level crime fighting. And while he did have to use some ingenuity and work with the commissioner and scheme a little bit to take down the mob, and there is still mob elements in here. Carmine Falcone is still a big player here, and Salvatore Maroni, even though we don't really see him, he is mentioned, and that is a big part of this story too. It's kind of the last remnant of the mob before the big bad villain crazies come into the picture. And it's such an interesting time period because of that. You have kind of the old guard of the mob, the crime that actually makes sense, that's for profit, leaving, and you have these super villains that are completely insane. They have no real motive, and Batman needs to really think outside the box for how to catch these and deal with them. And no matter what version of Batman you watch, there's always that moment where he needs to dig deep and not worry so much about the street level organized crime and really focus on the bigger threats that are coming, the ones that don't make sense. And that really is the Long Halloween in a nutshell. It's that perfect transition point to where Batman goes from just vigilante to superhero, the Batman that we know and love, where Batman tries to keep some sanity in this stew of insanity that is Gotham City. And on top of that, this movie actually has a legitimate mystery. You have some random guy killing off mobsters on every holiday, and then gets the name Holiday, the Holiday Killer, and you don't know who he is. Well, if you've read the comic book, you know who it is. But if you haven't read the comic book, or it's been a while and you don't remember all the details of who Holiday is, it's still a fascinating mystery to uncover. And even if you do know who he is, it's still fun to see all these side quests and all these different villains popping up here and there. And it's just a very entertaining Batman story. And I really hope part 2 sticks to the landing, because part 1 was a great start. I've always been a fan of The Long Halloween. I've read it once or twice, but it's not one that I return to very often. But after watching this movie, it did make me appreciate just how good The Long Halloween actually is. And I can't wait for part 2, and I'm definitely going to do a video on that, so stay tuned for that. But now I turn it over to you guys. What did you think about Batman The Long Halloween Part 1? Are you excited for part 2? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, I think I'm going to read this bad boy one more time.